We live in an era where it's not uncommon for people to reinvent themselves. People reinvent themselves in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and beyond. I've reinvented myself probably more times than one should. I probably am not done yet. And this is the story about my last iteration. When reinventing yourself, I've learned that to look for a great idea, look where no one else is looking. So this is the story about finding a new crop for our farm, and in the process, legalizing the forbidden fruit for the U.S. market. When Carolyn Blackwood and I moved to Walnut Grove Farm in 1999, it was a dream come true. To live in that beautiful rural setting, less than 2 hours from everything that New York City had to offer, was just magic. I had written a lot of children's books, and so I could imagine nothing finer than farming the fields spring, summer, fall, and then spending winters cooking hearty cold weather meals from produce I had grown and spending snowy evenings sitting in front of the fire writing. Walnut Grove Farm dates back to the 1830s. And when we moved to the farm, I brought a horticultural background with me. I had taught in the New York Botanical Gardens for about 20 plus years. And my father was the quintessential handyman. So I grew up learning carpentry, learning electricity, plumbing, automobile repair. And as a boy, I spent my summers wandering the woods of Maine with an uncle who was a full Penobscot Indian, and he infected me with his knowledge, his love, and his deep respect for nature. I felt like I had been practicing my whole life to live on this farm. In fact, I've often said I always expected to live there. I just didn't know where there was until we got Walnut Grove Farm. This beautiful place had been a dairy farm for probably almost forever, but I decided to make it a crop farm because of my horticultural background. And I had a restaurant in Europe for a while, so delicious, healthy food was really important to me. I kind of discarded the Northeast standbys of corn and apples and hay. The words farm and profit are not often used in the same sentence, so I was looking for a niche crop. I was looking for something that perhaps I could turn into a finished, value-added product and maybe have a year-round market. Of course, the first cash crop I thought about is still illegal. And I started to look for different types of different kinds of crops. Carolyn and I started to visit different farms to see what farmers were doing, and more importantly, to maybe discover what they weren't doing. And one weekend, we happened to visit a local winery, and they were making cassis that weekend. Now, cassis is a liqueur made from black currants. In fact, cassis is the French word for black currant. Now, I knew about black currants because black currants grew behind my restaurant in Bavaria, and I had cooked with them. I knew of their wonderful tart flavor and their incredible culinary properties. And I asked the vintner, where do you get your berries? And he said, with kind of a frown on his face, well, I've got to bring them in from Canada because they're illegal to grow in the United States. Illegal, forbidden, banned, cool. How can you walk away from a statement like that? I mean, the possibility of me legalizing that other cash crop I mentioned a moment ago was pretty unlikely, but currants, I immediately got excited. They're delicious, they're healthy, they grow on a bush, they'll grow in our soils, and the name currant is great. All of its sister homonyms have positive reference. Current events, water currents, ocean currents, wind currents, up to date, even currency. It was just too good. And I quickly found out that the reason they were banned was because of a fungus. And so I started to research the history and the science of this fungus. Well, it turns out that when the first settlers set foot on these shores, that they started to cut the most abundant species of tree in this part of the world, which was the eastern white pine. And they cut it as if it would never end. But of course, as with all natural resources, there was a finite amount. And by the late 1800s, huge swaths of the country had been denuded, and the majestic white pine was virtually gone. The first order of business of the newly formed U.S. Forestry Service in 1890s was to replenish and replant the eastern white pine in this part of the world. Now, there was no nursery infrastructure, and so they collected and sent 10 million white pine seeds to Germany for them to propagate and sent back as little trees. Well, when the little trees came back not what we expected with these healthy little white pines, but in fact what we got were small plants all infected with a fungus, white pine blister rust. Now, the Forestry Service had a problem on their hands. They had millions of infected trees, and if they couldn't find a solution quickly, the entire reforestation project would fail. So they started their research, and very quickly they learned that in order for this fungus to complete its life cycle and continue to infect little saplings, it needed an intermediary host. And that intermediary host was the botanical family of gooseberries and currants. Now, the fungus basically only infected small white pine trees, which of course was the focus of the reforestation project. And so by 1911, it was decided that the new imported pines were significantly more important than the indigenous currants, and Congress passed a law banning the commercial cultivation of these berries, and that was the death knell for currants in America. Now, I'm not a plant pathologist, but I looked over the science, and it seemed kind of incomplete and outdated to me. I mean, the white pine industry is not today what it was 100 years ago. There are no more large-scale plantings of white pines. And more importantly, there are now cultivars of currants which are resistant to the fungus. I mean, if a farmer's going to grow currants today, they're going to grow a resistant variety. If they grow a susceptible variety, not only might they damage the pines, but they're not going to get a crop. So there's really no reason for the ban. I discussed my findings and my thoughts with Cornell University's small fruit expert, and he concurred, and he said, the science is sketchy, and at best it's outdated. I thought, if I could overturn this law, not only would I have a new crop for the farm, but what a cool marketing story this would make. How does one overturn a law? I had no idea. So I went up to Albany to talk to some legislators, and my first meeting was with a New York State senator, and he heard my idea, and he sat back and he said, I have to tell you, without a really big market, voters, without great demand, voters, without farms growing currants, voters, it really wouldn't be worth our effort. It was obvious to me that I was going to have to find that one person that I could convince to champion this cause. And so I started going up to Albany 2-3 times a month, hoping to find that one person to just infect him with my great idea. But the more I tried, it seems the more I was avoided. I can almost remember hearing locks ticking as I was walking down the halls of the legislative office building. I got so desperate that I started bringing up boxes of Danish pastry, and I'd stick my business card in there, and I'd try to bribe law clerks and secretaries to sneak me in if a senator had a cancellation. And one day, I got a call from a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. And he said, Albany is my beat, and a lot of people are talking about this crazy currant guy. And I thought maybe we could do an interview and see if there's an article here. I said, sure, good press. So several weeks later, and lots of interviews on his part, the article came out. I couldn't believe it. It made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I was elated. until I read it. It was terrible. It took the side of the lumber industry. It questioned whether black currants should ever be grown again, and it basically said that black currants were too tart for the American palate anyway. But there's an old axiom in the media business. You can say whatever you want about me, just spell my name right. And sure enough, the next morning I got a call from another New York State senator who happened to be on the Agricultural Committee in Western New York, and he said, I read your piece. It sounds like a great idea for a new crop. Let's talk. And that was the beginning. We spent the next 6 months drafting a new bill. Now that the bill was in the works, I could talk to the legislators, and I started to lobby both the Assembly and the Senate. And when it went up for a vote before the Senate, it passed unanimously. And the following week, passed unanimously in front of the Assembly. And 6 months later, Governor George Pataki signed it into law, thereby overturning the 100-year-old ban and legalizing the commercial cultivation of currants. Thank you. It was a big deal. This David and Goliath story really struck a chord. Articles appeared in the New York Times, in the Boston Globe, in the Washington Post, CBS Market Watch, CNN.com, a feature article in Reader's Digest, and the Associated Press picked up the story, sent it out to 400 syndicated newspapers, and said, they entitled the article, "The Forbidden Fruit." It was great. Doesn't get better than that. Well, about a week later, I was still kind of basking in my success, and I got a call one day from a lobby firm in Washington, D.C., and the attorney said, you know, we're working on a bill, nothing to do with currants, but it does have a similar profile, and we'd wonder if you would participate in a conference call, and maybe we could learn something of your efforts. I said, sure. So got on the call, and the first question is, how long did it take? And I said, well, you know, start to finish, probably about a year. And one of the attorneys said, well, that's really quick to change the law. How much did it cost? And I said, firmly planting my tongue in my cheek, well, let's see, there was a dozen boxes of Danish, 3 tanks of gas. He said, no, how much did it cost in legal fees? I said, well, I didn't have a lawyer. There were no legal fees. One of the attorneys said, well, you can't change a law without legal representation. And I said, well, no one mentioned that to me. I'm sorry. So I imported 6,000 plants from Canada, and I planted the first currant farm in New York State, and I started to propagate some other cultivars and created the first dedicated currant nursery in the United States. And I've now been awarded the exclusive rights for all the Polish patented varieties, and all of this because I hope one day that this new crop is going to start to add to the coffers of a few family farms. But there are 2 sides to farming. There's the growing and there's the selling. Now, since currants were outlawed and they'd kind of remained off the radar screen of the American consciousness for 100 years, they were going to need a lot of introduction and a lot of explanation. And so I decided to do the marketing and the branding on top of the growing. Now, creating a source of supply and a market simultaneously is not something that's often done, and certainly not something that's done by anybody sane. But in addition to the wonderful taste, the amazing health benefits of black currants really help to drive sales. Black currants have twice the antioxidant of blueberries. They have 4 times the vitamin C of oranges, more potassium than bananas, plus calcium, iron, manganese, magnesium. And extensive research abroad has shown that the consumption of currants and currant products can actually help with several health issues, including skin problems, eye illnesses, lowering blood pressure. And a study came out of our very own Tufts University that said one day black currants may actually help thwart Alzheimer's. That was their word, thwart. Now, I expect that right now, a few of you out there are saying, what's he talking about? I've been eating currant scones, and I've been buying boxes of currants in the supermarket. Well, those aren't currants. In the 1920s, importers started to bring in a raisin, a small dried grape, from Greece. specifically from the Ionian region of Zakynthos and Corinth. And when the first shipment came in, labeling restrictions weren't so stringent back then, the Greek alphabet writing for Zakynthos and Corinth were mistranslated to Zante currants. And we have 80 years of cookbooks telling us to put currants in our soda bread and our rice pilaf dishes. And they're not currants. They're as close to a real currant as an apple is to a peach. Well, today, my brand, CurrantC, all puns intended, is on about a dozen different currant products, and we sell it through our website to all 50 states. And I can tell you that I am so thrilled that after 100 years of being outlawed and 10 years of my life, that this unbelievably delicious, amazingly healthy, forbidden fruit is now available to the U.S. market. Thank you.